Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our last session, live session for today. I'm Dr. Patrizia Franco, Demand Modeler at Connected Places Catapult, and today we will present on how preparing for the new normal, especially looking at modeling tools and impacts on the environment. Our first presenter for today is Gavin Jackman, who is Managing Director at Aimsun UK. He's got several years of experience in microsimulation and mesoscopic simulation using Aimsun. And today we'll present on the NEVFMA project and how our real-time prediction model could work in predicting uncertainties during this period. So now I will hand over to you, Gavin. If you have any questions, you need to put them in the Q&A chat of the conference room, and we will address them at the end of the full presentation. Over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Patricia. So I'm just going to carry on talking and assuming that my slide is showing. So thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to presenting this today. Got the afternoon after lunch slots for those in the UK that have just had their lunch, and the morning slot if you're in America. I'm going to be presenting this NEVMA project. It's been a really exciting project. It's been a fantastic learning opportunity for us all. And it's been really interesting purely because of the timing of the project. We started off in 2019, September 2019, finished in November 2019. So for the majority of the project, we had the COVID situation going on. So basically, the NEVMA project was using Aimsun Live for real-time prediction. And it was integrating itself with an air quality model to really understand the issues of road and traffic flow across the network and how that relates to air quality and what we can do to mitigate against poor air quality by using or comparing different traffic management strategies to reduce hotspots of air quality across the network. It's a rather complex project, so I'm going to try and break it down into 3 simple steps. So firstly, monitoring, then prediction, and then decision support. So on the monitoring side, we started off with an Aimsun Next network. This was a county-wide network with this nation across the work based on 2019. And we took 9 months from start to finish to build this network. It was a mesoscopic level of detail. We integrated traffic flow, traffic information counters from 3 different suppliers, Highways England, Vivacity, and common database that's been used in Oxfordshire, which is a Cloud Amber common database, which has a variety of other ATC feeds and scoop feeds, etc., etc. So what that gave us was a mesoscopic network up to 2019 conditions. We started capturing data, and then we start to analyze that data flow across the network. So whereas traditional model will be an AM/PM peak model, we're actually looking at a 24/7, 365 days pattern or traffic flow across the network. And then from that, we then start to understand where the patterns and clusters of flow across the network then are covering. And from that, we get some cluster analysis, and that then actually mitigates us down to 10 different patterns that we built into this system. So we have 10 different patterns that represent the flow on any single day of the network. So we start to forget that it's a Tuesday or a Wednesday or a Friday or a Sunday. And we just start to go, okay, today, right now, we're actually matching that to a pattern that is the most representative of the traffic across the network at that particular time. And that gives us a profile. And from that, we then outputted out a prediction every 15, 30, 45, 60 minutes. So we've got an hour prediction based on real-time and historic traffic flow. The right-hand side of the screen shows you the outputs of this. So this is so what we then did was we outputted tailpipe emissions. So we had the London emissions model input into our software, and then we outputted emissions out via across the network into a dispersion model. And in that dispersion model, we were really interested in understanding where the hotspots were. So we divided up the network over 13 different zones, and these are our key performance indicator zones. So we can understand and we can measure the tailpipe emissions, the air quality, the traffic across the north to south on the A34, which is the strategic road network, the ring road round, the corridors into the city centre itself. And this was all around Oxford and Oxfordshire County. So the whole deployment, this is just a snapshot. We had 180 different data feeds for the 3 key providers providing into the system. We had live VMS, We have all the geographical data from all the signal control within the system. We have multiple air quality feeds, and not just air quality, we have air quality, we have weather, we have topographical, and that's all in the dispersion model. And we combine that all together to become a real-time decision support system. So as I said, 15, 30, 45, 60 minutes, simulated through Aimsun Live using the simulation and analytical predictions. So we've got both types of predictions available to us. And then we were comparing 3 different response plans against to do nothing for each incident and event. It's really interesting because, as I talked about at the beginning, we've got the COVID-19 situation that happened. So in the pink area, this is the traditional traffic pattern from 2019. So this is the upper and lower limits of the traffic profile across a day. As you see, January and February before COVID really tracked that pattern quite nicely. But as the year went on, March, lockdown started to happen, the traffic dips off. April, May, massive jump down as traffic really dived. And then we started to build back up over the summer period as lockdown in the UK started to allow people to actually journey across the network again, June, July and August. September into October, again, was really back to virtually the normal. A little bit lower in the afternoon, but the morning AM peak was pretty much the same as normal. And then in November, which is the purple line, we saw traffic drop down again. And this was really due to the tiering coming in as UK's started to prevent us from moving around, UK government. And then obviously in December, we had then a further lockdown. So it's really quite interesting to see the monitoring across that. And this is a generalized view of all the patterns across the network. And this is just the percentage drop that we saw as that period of time goes on a rolling 7-day average. So we learned a lot about data and we learned a lot about data flows. But how do we do this? So if we just go to the system, so this is the interface that we developed within the project. These are all the traffic counters across the network. And what you see at the bottom, and this is just looking at one detector, but on multiple different days, you'll see that the red line with the black dots is the actual traffic data. The pink is the generalized flow. And you'll see that the actual data varied from day to day. It really does show you that not one day fits all. So the old traditional strategic modelling approach to looking at how people travel across our network is slightly questionable when you're considering the use of that type of method within real-time decision making. So we did 3 use cases within the project. We closed the M40, which is a major part of the strategic road network, north to south. We made a full road closure on that motorway. And we evaluated where the traffic then went and the impact on air quality. I'm not going to talk about that one just because of time. I'll focus on the last 2 though. Kennington Bridge, again, a full road closure, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then the A34 Botley Road. And that's a key area because it's one of the main areas in Oxfordshire that on the strategic road network that regularly goes above the legal limit on air quality. So Kennington Bridge. So Kennington Bridge is due to be replaced. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to evaluate the impact of different traffic management situations during the construction of that bridge or reconstruction of that bridge. On the left-hand side, we have the do nothing scenario. So this is basically a blockage of the road and we've got traffic density. That's what we're looking at the moment. So we're looking at the traffic density of the road network. So after 15 minutes, you'll start to see that there's the density of traffic increases. You start to get congestion as vehicles aren't able to move around the network. On the right-hand side, we've got the traffic management strategy of contraflow, so keeping one lane open in both directions. So whilst we start to see that there is a bit more traffic than normal, if I had a base case where there would be absolutely no traffic and it would just be flowing, free flowing, this shows that after 15 minutes, we do start to get a bit of traffic build up, but it's not too bad. But as I just go through the build, 30 minutes, traffic density on the left gets worse, 45 and 60. And yet on the right-hand side, just keeping one lane open, you'll see that the traffic density doesn't build up. The problem with this is that by a local road network, which the bridge is on, just by closing that, the impact is then quite considerable to the strategic road network, the A34 going north to south. It's a major road in the UK. It goes from the ports in the south, Portsmouth and Southampton, up to the Midlands. So it has a good lot of, a fair amount of freight traffic. So Highways England really want to keep that route as clear and free flowing as possible. And yet if we have density from the local network, traffic blocking back onto that network, then it really does start to have some considerations for the overall operation of the network for more than just the local residents. And this is just the extra part of the project. So whilst we provided our tailpipe emissions into the dispersion model that EarthSense, our partners in the project, created, this is just a visualization of what that then means. So in the dispersion model, this is the tailpipe emissions. This is other sensors providing us information in relation to other emissions within the area, other air quality. This is the topographical data, the weather data, and it's also the terrain data. 15, 30 and 60 minutes. So again, you start to see that a full closure really does start to affect how air quality disperses across the network. And it's not just associated to the road network now, it's actually dispersing across the countryside towards the urban environment of Oxfordshire. So that was case study 2. I'll just now spend a couple more minutes on case study on the Botley Road. So this is where we were looking at the air quality threshold. I'm not going to show you the visuals here now, but what I'm going to show you that even despite the variability of COVID traffic, 76% of our predictions were in a 15% tolerance, and we're quite happy with that. We could improve that over time if we knew that COVID was going to carry on forever and ever. But on the basis of what we set up within the limitations of the project, we were quite happy with the level of our predictions. Importantly, if we needed to do any action or take any mitigation, we need to know how many days the air quality was exceeded. So legal thresholds exceeded on 57% of the evaluated days. And of those 57%, of those evaluated days, 65% of the time, a different traffic management strategy that we had in the system benefited the scenario rather than the do nothing. So it actually meant that the comparison of different strategies really actually provided some valuable input. And importantly, whilst we were evaluating 3 different traffic management strategies against do nothing, it wasn't always the same traffic management strategy. Again, going back to that situation, not one day is the same day. And out of that, did it make a difference? Well, we had an average benefit of 5% recorded, an improvement on air quality of 5%, but it really did range from 2 to 20%. So it was, again, quite a range between different days, different volumes of traffic. So
1 minute left, Gavin.
And this is my last slide, so that's perfect. So just to summarise the project, and it has been a very rapid canter through, typical days are not typical. Real-time monitoring, prediction and decision support systems can be deployed with benefits, even during unpredictable times. The system learns and adjusts the longer it is deployed. We're keeping it live for another 6 months to see, to monitor and evaluate with normalised traffic conditions, especially now that the traffic is back to normal, or pretty much back to normal. So it's been quite an exciting project. I'd like to thank our variety of partners and funders, Highways England, and any questions later on in the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. So our next speaker for today is Matthew Juckes from Aimsun, USA this time. He specialized in microsimulation modeling and he has over 20 years of experience in that, using several modeling tools. Matthew is going to present today, are our models ready for the new normal? Over to you, Matthew.
Thanks. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So are models ready for the new normal? Our models have really been built off of a very historical way of dealing with things and with historical trends, looking at how the growth will happen. And COVID has really introduced a new situation that we really haven't experienced in the past. You know, we went overnight from significantly lighter traffic than what we know normally. Use of transit has stopped. Ride sharing became almost irrelevant. And really there was a correlation between how COVID was impacting the nation in the US to how traffic was being impacted on that side. So one of the things we looked at, because we've been working with an Aimsun Live in San Diego since 2011, and we have lots of data. So we did the correlation of looking at how the cases throughout the US impacted the traffic flow, and also looked at how that also impacted by the number of deaths. not to be morbid there, but one of the things we saw is in the US, maybe more so than in other countries, there was definitely a denial of COVID until one day suddenly it was reality. So it was a very quick spike from no impact to almost significant shutdown and things really taking a turn for the worse. And really in April is when a lot of the US and Canada shut down and closed facilities and stopped work and at home, stopped work and went to the work at home. We went to a situation where everybody doubted whether or not we could do work from home properly and efficiently before this. And now suddenly forced to do it. It was a struggle at first, but after a month, everybody sort of started to get used to it. One of the interesting things on this slide also is by looking at the severity in the initial phases with the US in the number of deaths, particularly in the New York area, for example, really was what hit home and what it made it real. Maybe, you know, had it been different and more like the flu, we probably wouldn't have seen what we saw in terms of traffic reductions. And that will play forward as we look forward, as with the vaccine and with things improving, there may be spikes in the number of cases, but hopefully the impacts of those cases is going to drop significantly. So one of the things, and this sort of plays off of a bit done, is in developing the San Diego Live, we really looked at large sets of historical data. We have years and years of data and are able to analyze the different patterns. We know that a weekday is different from a weekend, a holiday is different from a normal weekday. We also know that a Monday and a Friday are different from each other and different from Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So we really developed all of this robust information for feeding our online predictive system. The interesting thing is, what you can see here is when we started looking at the post-COVID data is obviously we saw a significant 40 to 50% drop in the travel. But the interesting thing is we saw two different trends. One was a weekday pattern, what we call pattern 6 in the graph on the right, and one was a weekend. And you can see that the trend stayed the same. We still have an AM and a PM peak period for it, just it's much significantly less traffic within these cases. So now the biggest question is, knowing that this change is happening, is what is the future going to look like? We know that we're not going to just bounce back to where we were before. I think when you looked at what happened in the US in 2008, 2009, 2010 with the increase in gas prices and the recession in the housing market, we saw a reduction in traffic, which actually bounced back afterwards, that it was just a blip and the predictions were still, the long-term forecasts were still accurate. But COVID may have changed how we really view the trip to work and transit in general and traffic in general. So the historical models that we've used in the past now are going to have to change. We know that the use in transit is going to change. Not everybody's comfortable with being on a bus right now. It's going to take time for people to get back to that. Ride sharing, significantly drop in use of ride sharing. Prior to COVID, we saw ride sharing and autonomous vehicles and all of these things as a huge market growth. And this has definitely had an impact on that. The other thing that probably isn't going to go away is the work from home situation. We've now proven that in most cases, we can be successful working from home. Obviously, the trend now is that a more hybrid system where you mix a work from home quality of life with still going into the office from time to time. But in the US, I don't know about other countries, in the US, what we've really seen is large corporations have looked now at the opportunity of reducing their cost in having office space. So now they're only keeping more minimal office space than what they had before and having more sort of a hot desk type situation rather than having everybody having their own set desk. The other aspect of this is the potential for seeing, especially in the short term, a much more significant increase in single occupancy vehicles. Early surveys here sort of showed that people were going to be much more comfortable driving their own car to work rather than other methods or carpooling. This will in turn increase the need for general purpose lanes and the need for parking throughout the network. So one of the things we saw also is that COVID is not a thing that's just going away. It comes and goes, and I think one of Gavin's I saw in one of Gavin's charts, a very interesting part is as we've hit a new sort of peak in COVID throughout the world, you can see the drops in the traffic. But what we see here on the left is in San Diego, the overall traffic used to be at about 3.5 million per month, and it dropped to almost half of that in April when the most severe lockdowns went. It gradually climbed, but then it stabilized and then dropped again when we had, in the US, we had Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that we saw spikes after that. And the challenge with this is that we can't predict necessarily how the growth is going to take because we see changes, and we need to be dynamic enough to capture those changes. So the other side of this is what we're now finally starting to see is congestion is making a comeback. It's not quite what it was before, but I have 3 examples from our San Diego system where on the left-hand side, you can see what the typical week would look like in 2019 with the PM peak. This is the northbound out of town, leaving, going home trip. You could see that the speeds dropped significantly, and on worst days were below 30 miles per hour on average during the PM peak. Then you get to during the lockdown period where you had a 10 mile per hour variation, but really free flow conditions. There was no congestion, there was not many people on the roads. And then this was from this spring, 2021, where we start to see the congestion start to build. Some days we're seeing it drop to 50, but we do see some days where there are events happening and things happening that are causing congestion that we need to be able to handle and ready to prepare for this. And this is where we get to the part where are our model procedures ready for how we handle things? The typical day is no longer the typical day. The changes, as we get back to what the new norm may be, the changes aren't going to take place overnight. It's going to be a slow and very dynamic situation. In that sense, we need to sort of combine our traditional data sources with more dynamic new data sources that are available. And we need to look at an aim for integrating these dynamic data sources within our modeling tools and using those and bringing AI into the picture, artificial intelligence, data analytics, machine learning, whatever you want to call it, bringing those things into our modeling practices to help manage the changes and spikes. The big part we're going to need to do is the what if scenarios are much more significant because we're no longer looking at what if scenarios where it's just talking about capacity changes on the roadway. The what if scenario really impacts now the demand and the changes in the demand from one spike to the next. So wanted to just look quickly at the differences of data. From my history with modeling, we've always relied on being able to go out and do some manual counts for a week, put down some ATRs, have regional models for our initial starting point for our demands, and then even be able to tie in some origin destination surveys. The challenge with this is this gives you a very small snapshot of the view. And what we really need to look at is bringing in some of the automated data sources that are becoming more and more available. System data such as detectors, Bluetooth, and tolling are now being collected and available through data source APIs. We need to look how we will bring connected vehicle data into the modeling world, and also what third-party sources may provide useful information for us. there are sources in the United States like Here, TomTom, Streetlight that provide a wealth of information that has gotten better and better with time. One of the things that the US and Canada are lagging behind maybe with the rest of the world is we don't connect our sensors at traffic lights for counting cars and for providing that wealth of information. So we're sometimes hamstrung to be able to get the information that we need. And most likely we're gonna have to look at a combination of these automated sources with the conventional data collection processes. Finally, looking at how Aimsun has sort of looked at this is we have our next planning tool, but also our live solution, as Gavin was showing before, it brings artificial intelligence into the picture and the ability to detect the changes within the traffic and be able to match the best pattern and demand, and also even do on-the-fly adjustments to these demands to be better able to manage the condition and predict out what the next hour, 2 hours is going to look like. Patterns with Aimsun Next can be used to develop these models needed to understand the current impacts. We need to change how we do business.
1 minute left, Matthew.
Okay, I will speed up a bit then. So as I was saying before, AI is going to be a critical piece to helping us in being dynamic and being able to manage the changes. Because the other side of it also is we're not just talking about cars anymore. We're definitely seeing more of an active transportation world where pedestrians and bikes are much more prevalent. And we're also seeing in New York in particular, they closed 87 streets to cars. They also closed parking lanes and active lanes to provide more outdoor dining for the restaurants. We also saw a transformation where bike roads and pedestrian roads were increased. This really flows into a model where we don't know that these changes are going to go away. The population in New York City, an example, has really liked this new streetscape, and we have to be prepared to handle the challenges with these streetscapes. One of the things we did, and I'll be very quick, is we looked at the impact of having an existing condition. Oh,
time is up.
I went too far. I went too far.
That's fine, because your time was
anyway, I'm out of time. But what we did look at, just to summarize, is looking at the fact that we're going to need wider sidewalks to handle the pedestrians who now want more space. Before, as a pedestrian, we didn't mind sort of being crammed up together. Now we're really looking for more of the pedestrians want more of a comfortable field while they're walking. Sorry for going long. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. And we will talk about this later. Now, our next speaker is Simon Lusby from City Science. It's a perfect presentation because it's bound well with what Matt said before. He's head of transport planning at City Science, and they're using data-driven approach towards modeling. Simon is going to present how we can use data-driven modeling for decarbonizing transport. And he also said for non-modelers, which is quite interesting. Over to you, Simon.
Thanks, Patricia. And Matthew, that was actually really interesting. So I didn't mind you going over. Just a quick rundown. So quickly, City Science, probably not as well a known name as Aimsun, close, but not quite. We are a company built based on the mission to decarbonize. We're based out of Exeter. For those unaware, is a small place in the southwest of England. I'm from New Zealand, so I'm quite keen on some of the other presentations that have been going on and hearing some of my ex-colleagues and things. Basically, we cover everything from transport, smart cities through to energy, but with an angle of decarbonization and data evidence. Now, modeling's at a crossroads, the way I see it, or a junction, if you want to talk, depending on what mode you're, I guess, talking about. And I don't think it's about the new normal in terms of COVID, but it's a different new normal than what people are talking about. And that new normal is transport emissions. And the fact that a lot of what we're doing around transport schemes is actually getting pushed back at us. And so these are three schemes that we've seen with three news headlines that we've seen in the UK recently around Heathrow, Silvertown, and just the general roads program. So what we're seeing is that although transport is delivering a third of the emissions in most places, globally we're seeing a shift towards more people having that focus on decarbonisation, whether it's through C40 or other initiatives, the Paris Agreement and things like that. And in some places, that's even more important than delivering more homes, is actually making sure that we decarbonise. And that is kind of more important because it's the planet that we're trying to protect here. And often what we're seeing is that's not considering the fact that roads are contributing majorly to this. And we're not necessarily seeing that coming through in our modelling, which isn't a criticism of anyone who's doing that modelling. It's more that the modelling approaches that we've had in the past, and the reason why we're at this crossroad, is we need to be thinking that step ahead, which actually in Gavin's presentation was talking all about emissions. That totally dilutes my point, but never mind. We'll pretend that didn't happen. Thanks, Gavin. So we can't continue as we have for the past few decades. And we're seeing that coming through in the presentations that we've seen at International Modelling World so far. So we've got so much data, as Matthew's clearly pointed out. But at the moment, a lot of that analysis of it is then error-prone and bespoke, or I'm just going to read those. It's inconsistent and time-consuming. And so what we need are these tools that can actually do that in an automated way. We see that with Aimsun, we see that with some of these other tools that are coming through. But we need to make sure that we're using those in a consistent way. So we're bringing in those APIs and translating it in a consistent approach so that everyone can use it. And we're going to need to do that as an industry as quickly as possible to make sure that we are actually able to answer broader questions than just what is the traffic speed and how many cars are going past. And it's a global challenge. So, but what you'll find is that very few places actually have a plan, or as I put there, a roadmap of how to get out of that challenge. And so as transport modelers, we need to be coming in. We are the evidence behind transport. So as an industry, we need to be providing that evidence of how do you get a roadmap out of this climate challenge. And the key thing there is we can't just be saying, oh, there needs to be around about the same amount of cars, congestion should be about the same. Actually, there needs to be a lot less cars, a lot more lane dieting, a lot more reallocation of road, which may sound pie in the sky, but it's actually going to need to happen in order for us to see the shift. And we need to be the ones supporting that and evidencing that. And that needs to be our new normal, so to speak. So COVID's shown that there's a lot more scrutiny into our models. And I think the slides before me have really shown that we don't have a normal day anymore. And not sure when we will have said normal day again. Not that we necessarily had one anyway, because Fridays and Mondays were always a random thing. But also, our transport models need to not necessarily be a black box where we get the results at the end of the process, which is where things like Aimsun Live come in quite nicely, where it appears that they can actually get throughout the period. So we need to make sure that we're actually providing that evidence up front so that decision makers can actually make those decisions. And we need to be thinking beyond the model. Hence, a solar panel in the middle of a field is thinking beyond just, I could have sheep there. So we need to be thinking about all the different modal elements that can contribute to making places zero carbon. So this is something that was done for RTPI by ourselves and Vectos and LDA, where it looks at a standard place in the UK and then starts to work out what its pathway out is. And a lot of that is around mode share. A lot of that is around electric vehicles, but not all of it. And what we were finding is not one single thing is going to solve our way out. So we need models that can actually address as many of these things as possible so that we can evidence them in a consistent way. We also need to be thinking a bit broader. So not just transport data, but how do we integrate socio-demographics? How do we make sure that carbon is at the forefront of the inputs and the outputs? So how do we make sure that when we're taking fleet coming in, whether it's and we're recording them on the street, and we probably know exactly what those fleets are, how do we carry that through our model, but then aggregate it and disaggregate it in the right way so we carry that data forward? And then also, how do we make sure that cycling, walking, public transport are actually at the forefront here, rather than just saying they're kind of an element of a highways model? And we do see that with some of the modeling software that's coming through. We need to make sure that that's at the forefront of it, particularly if you are just doing highway modeling. You need to still be thinking about these other modes. And how do we expand our thinking to do that? So the other thing there is also actually engaging with our end users. And maybe, I know from my experience with the Now company that our software developers quite liked the idea that you could go and work from home. No more interaction with people. Brilliant. But not everyone is going to be seeing it that way. And actually, some of them love engaging with people, I joke. But we need to make sure that we're actually still getting out there and we're collating the views of not just our customers, but also using tools like Place Builder, to collect all the potential schemes, all the potential interventions, that sort of way. So we're thinking a bit more broadly about what other people's needs are within that space. And we as an industry need to make sure that we're bringing that through. We also need to be thinking a bit more about how we visualize that, how people interact with that so that they have greater scrutiny. So how is someone who's your client seeing your model? Is it just as a static output within your report? Or can they visualize it in some other way where they can actually look through that, or other people can come back and look at the modeling and see it rather than having to go and find a PDF of a report from 2017, which was just what I was doing an hour ago. Now, and then the other thing is, how do we provide open and evidence roadmaps to net zero within these modeling and within this? And how do we make sure that that's clear and it sets that precedent? And also better integrate with those wider ambitions, but also wider policies as well for number one there, which I missed. And then we also need to be thinking about visualizations for non-modelers. Now, this is the best visualization of a road network that I've seen so far. Others can please provide them to me. You can find me on LinkedIn. I will welcomely accept them. This is a picture of a leaf, but you can see that in some ways, this is a better output as a visualization than a lot of what we see, where this shows, hypothetically, all the different places, all the different emissions sourcing off that, or it could be the road noise, or it could be anything. But it's this sort of thinking that we need to be almost seeing, putting visuals in front of people where they can go, actually, I get that. This line is thicker than that line. These ones are connected up in this sort of way. And we can see that with the different layering. And nature is providing that to us. So we need to be thinking, if we're going to just use red and green, how do we actually visualize and answer the answers, not just set out the questions, but actually provide the answers back? And then, so I guess my other challenge there to the industry, and you'll note I have put my software up here because we do provide software which does some of this. So there is a bit of a pitch there, but I apologize for that. But we need to make sure that what we're doing as an industry is transparent and searchable, so you can actually find places within your models that's not, or you can, the clients can actually go in and look at them. We need to make it easy for even modelers to understand, which may sound silly, but we need to be able to understand each other's work, and often that isn't necessarily the case. And we need to embrace openness, whether that's an open model or free models that free source software that's out there. Build consultation into what we're doing, and a lot more, particularly in the model development. So we're making sure that we're actually answering all of the needs of the authority, and lots of other elements there. But I think that the key thing that COVID's really pointed to us is when people have tried to go back and use some of those models, we need to make sure that the uncertainty and the assumptions that we've laid out are clear, that some of these models are no longer fit for purpose. And have we really laid that out clearly from the forefront? We also have to understand what those decision makers are needing, not just the person who's commissioning us. And then you have to make it interactive. I mean, Remix is the forerunner for this. Cadence is coming up to also do that. But I think, how do we make it more interactive for actually the use? And then the other thing is, now these models are publicly funded, but they're not made public. And so I think we need to also be thinking around that. And that this is no longer necessarily directly to the modelers, it's also to the clients, of how do we make those models, which are publicly funded, available to the public to use, available openly in some way. And I don't mean the whole model, because if you just give an entire model out, you're not going to have the right people who can actually know how to use it. But how do we make some of the functionality around that usable or testable? Or is it what they did for the Olympics, where they ran so many different scenarios and then you just kind of filter through them and pick out which ones you were looking at? But how do we make that so that non-modelers can actually use this in some way and connect with it, if that is what there is a desire to do, which we believe there is. Because often what we're finding is that it's an exorbitant cost which we're delivering these models. It's coming at the last minute, which is actually delaying decision making. And we're doing far more scenarios than we necessarily need to, if we could have done some of this what if up front. And we've already seen the benefit of of free source and open data. And we're seeing that all around the world, but here's some examples just from within London, where I'm based. And this has changed completely how we're doing, how people are traveling. It's changed community engagement, it's changed how we get congestion data, how we understand delays, and how we understand when the network's closing. So how can we apply that to a modeling situation when we make things more open?
2 minutes left, Simon.
Thanks. I probably won't need all two. And then the other thing is we need to make sure that we're applying these better approaches. So yeah, open models where anyone can use them. This is more of a summary. better approaches to version control, model storage, calibration, for example, our software, which I may have mentioned. Transparent, so models can be publicly visible and easily checkable, so that they're not just that black box in the background, and more around that what if functionality, so we actually can, so that more people can come in and say, but what if this happened? But what if that happened? What if this happened? And we can actually answer those questions, or they can answer those questions in a bit more of an iterative way, rather than just saying, here are the 7 scenarios which we're going to do, and these are all which we were commissioned to do. This is all we're going to do. That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh wow, I was not expecting that. Thank you, Simon, for keeping to the time. So our next speaker is David Connolly. He's Director of Technical Development at SYSTRA. He's passionate about innovation in modeling and also low emission transport strategies. He's going to talk today about how we can model a changing world from an emissions modeling perspective. Floors is yours. Virtual floors is yours.
Lovely. Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, so I am, as Patricia says, my name is David Connolly. I'm Director of Innovation at SYSTRA, and I'm particularly interested in the emissions impact of transport, both air quality and decarbonisation, so greenhouse gas emissions. And the COVID pandemic clearly raised the challenge, which is how we can predict what the emission levels will be post-COVID. So I'm very much not interested, or not talking about what COVID did. So during COVID and lockdowns, I am trying to predict what the traffic emissions will be when we have returned to a post-COVID new normal with vaccines widely available, but behaviour still remaining changed. So how do we predict that, and what does it mean for decisions about emissions, either air quality or greenhouse gas? SYSTRA undertook during COVID lockdown, we did we did 2 very large surveys UK wide. So because the behaviour had changed so much, there was no point in just measuring it. We had to ask people what they thought their behaviour would be in terms of working from home, not using public transport and so forth. So very much looking forward to how they would see their behaviour. And we continue to do that research in a variety of local authorities across the UK. There is a slight bias. It's a panel survey, so it's maybe not entirely representative of the population as a whole, including those who maybe are not online and so forth. But we have weighted that survey as best we can to cover the hard to reach groups. And it was a big enough sample to be able to talk at a regional level, both sort of London and beyond London in various different regions. And in particular, it was the survey was designed to answer the question that we knew we were going to need to answer, which is what will happen to trip rates in terms of working from home, business travel, being online, and so forth. It was asking all of those questions of a big enough sample that we could try and predict some of those key post-COVID impacts. And because we could see that was coming, the distrust of public transport and the working from home in particular as being likely to affect traffic patterns as even beyond COVID, if you like, as well as during COVID. So that survey formed those 2 surveys formed the basis of some of our understanding of the future. We then did some further research, and very particularly looking at air quality. So we're looking at short-term effects over the next couple of years, because in the UK, that's the timescales for achieving compliant air quality in the city centres, and which impacts would last from beyond COVID into the time when that air quality compliance was going to be needed. And we identified 10 that had, using sort of effectively strategic level analysis, we identified 10 impacts that were significant enough to be worth considering further in more detail. And they are listed on this slide and the next one. So economic downturn, so not having a job to go to, particularly in the city centres, will obviously reduce commuting, but it will also create the travel patterns for those who are not in employment. Obviously, if you're out of work, you don't just sit at home, you do make other trips. So you have to pick up that rebound into other journey purposes. Commuting reduced to working from home, so that you do have a job, but you're doing it from home. And we have split that between office-based work and non-office, because obviously their response is very different. We transport planners think everybody can work from home because we can, but actually if you're a frontline worker, or working in agriculture, or working a lot of medical facilities, or in factories, you can't work from home. So we need to separate effectively office from not office within that. Economic downturn and business travel, so again, not having a meeting to go to, and we separated that from doing meetings online as two different responses. Retail reduction, and that isn't just COVID, that is the city centre vitality due to COVID, but also just general growth in online shopping, basically, and not making shop trips to go shopping. Then from that, there is an increase. So that's item 6. 7 then is the goods vehicles. There's been a very steady growth, high level of growth in goods vehicles, and again that's been accelerated during COVID. Some of that's related to the online shopping delivery, and we had to understand that and build that in. And then other leisure, so social activities and so forth, health, whatever, trips to the city centre, which tends to be a smaller impact than commuting, but worth keeping in mind. Reduction in the bus service. Can we assume that the bus networks will all survive COVID and come out the other side with exactly the same service frequency as previously, or will actually the loss of revenue from a year's worth of lockdown affect the viability of the bus services, and will you end up with a lighter bus service, a lower reduced frequency bus service in the short to medium term? And then finally, from an emissions point of view, the car buying and the van buying behaviour has changed during COVID because the showrooms are all shut. Will that last through until a couple of years from now, or will it very quickly rebound back to the previous profile? So those were our top 10 identified, and we undertook the research and produced the case study. Sorry, we produced the evidence for that, the evidence base for those, and produced a set of technical notes which we're now keeping updated as additional evidence comes out. But effectively, that was our starting point. The values and our recommendations are here, and in particular, I'll just flag the one about the office work. If you are looking at reducing commuting in your assumptions, is you do need to distinguish between office and not office, and the other measures are for the city we were doing our air quality modelling for, which was basically a northern English area, so excluding London in our statistics. So the numbers are here. I'm not particularly interested in them, but just the idea is that we have done that work before then trying to work out how to do the scenarios. Most of those impacts reduce city centre emissions because they're reducing car use, but there's one or two, including the LGV deliveries, and the lack of bus, or the reduction in buses, causing an increase in car use, and the big one, which is the fleet not being upgraded, the car fleet in particular. So over on the right, there's a net increase in bad air quality emissions because the fleet is a year older or 6 months older than it would have been if COVID hadn't affected car buying. So having done all of that essentially back of the envelope analysis in terms of high level rather than testing everything in detail, we agreed with our client that there was too many impacts to test them all and every combination of them, because we would effectively be running detailed models from then till now. This work was all kicked off last summer. So instead of that, we had identified 3 dimensions effectively, which then ultimately gave us 5 different future scenarios, with the 6th being the scenario 0, which was the old forecast, the old business as usual. So we separated economic impacts from the behavioural impact. So what was due to people not having a job versus choosing to travel differently to a given job, for example. Similarly, business trips, not having a trip to go to, we separated from deciding not to travel for a meeting, but doing it online instead. So we separated the economic effects and the behavioural effects, and that gave us 2 dimensions. And then we added a 3rd dimension, which was the government or client policy, where they would try and mitigate some of the effects that they didn't like or didn't want to see, including, for example, the bus network being reduced. So you would end up with a policy dimension, which was the 3rd dimension of my sugar cube, which you would end up with mitigating some of the worst economic impacts, in particular, by essentially throwing money at the problem or other policy measures. So, and then within that, then with or without the ongoing behavioural change that we think COVID will have generated. So that gave us 5 scenarios that was much more manageable, and they were well defined, and it was sort of good scenario practice to sort of give them sexy names and so forth. So that we basically ended up with those 5 scenarios, and we tested those in using the detailed models, multimodal models, and with all the journey purposes that we've talked about separated, so that we could unpick which car trip was which, rather than just assuming all cars were equal, as it were, in the traffic. So we put them together. I'll not bore you with the details, but that's the top 10 impacts being put together in various combinations. So we ended up with a package of measures that was all the economic impacts or all the behavioural impacts, and then putting them together in the various combinations described. In a parallel study, we also did a lot of post-COVID modelling in the East Midlands, so Derby and Nottingham area, travel to work area, and in this one we identified a similar list, but in this case just 5 impacts, and instead of scenarios, we effectively built them up incrementally. So our first test started with just working from home, second test was working from home and use of online meetings, third test was the same as test 2 but with internet shopping, etc. So it was more of a cumulative approach to the modelling, to try and avoid having to do all combinations of individual measures and how they interact. Not at all interested, and you shouldn't be interested either in the actual results, but the idea is that as we go across the charts that we presented, it's the package builds up, so you can see the size of the step created by each new effect without having lots of combinations of if this and then that, or if the other. So it was a cumulative building up, but it didn't say which of these impacts were more likely, or what if some impact early on didn't happen and you ended up with some different combination. So it was an attempt to simplify what very rapidly becomes a complicated reporting problem. If you have so many scenarios and so many impacts that are correlated to each other, that you get bogged down in the modelling. And the
2 minutes left, David.
Yeah, so we were trying to avoid get that modelling overload, basically. From that, the conclusions I want to talk about in the last 2 minutes are the ways of handling that uncertainty. And there was another session earlier in Modelling World, which was ANZ5, which I would point interested readers to, which had dealt with this idea of uncertainty and variability more than I have time for. But effectively, I've identified 7 ways that you could tackle that uncertainty and the difficulty of predicting all the different impacts, going from ignore it to deciding to not ignoring it, but deciding it's too difficult, modelling them all individually and letting the decision makers choose what they like from that raft of numbers, define a set of scenarios, and then just compare your preferred option within those small set. Best case and worst case. Monte Carlo, some of you will have heard of that. It's effectively a stochastic method and is more about variability than uncertainty, but I haven't time to discuss that just now, but I'll come back to it. And then finally, do we want to try and just continue the old way of doing things, which is to try and estimate best guess, central forecast, and hope that's close enough to reality outturn? Pros and cons of those I will pick up again in the questions and answers, but they are listed here for the record, and if you have time to read through them, you will see. But basically, the ignoring is not a good option, and putting them in the too difficult pile is not a good option, and you end up with the discrete scenarios working, but I am still not convinced that we, certainly in the UK, that those scenarios feed properly into the decision-making process. And I will talk, hopefully in question and answers, more about that as to how the modelling can be used to inform decision-making rather than just slowing it down effectively. Concluding remarks, we SYSTRA, I think, have now got a very strong evidence base for what the various impacts will be and the scale of those impacts. We still, I think, need to do better at working out how to combine those impacts in a way that decision makers can find helpful. And I just threw in a couple of quotes there. That uncertainty is an uncomfortable position, particularly for decision makers, but certainty is an absurd one. So a quote from Voltaire that I nicked from someone else's presentation. And another nicked quote, which is from the chairman of General Electric: no amount of sophistication is going to allay the fact that all of your knowledge is about the past and all of your decisions are about the future. The end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. And you are slightly on time. Now, can everybody switch on their videos when we start the Q&A sessions? I did not have to remind everybody to do the question in the Q&A because questions questions just started flowing. So I will start with the most voted question, and it's more around forecasting. We know that in an earlier session, Warren Hatch said that people thought cities would be measurable different after the financial crash, and even after the, I think it's the 9th of September or of November.
9/11, when the World Trade Center.
Exactly. I think it was 11th of September.
Yeah.
Sorry, I crashed with the US dating system. And they were wrong. Will cities return to, and traffic in cities and commuters will return to cities once the COVID emergency is over? Matt, do you want to reply to that?
I'll start. I'm sure everybody's got a bit of a point to this.
Yeah.
I think the big difference between the financial crash and 9/11 is we didn't see people moving out of the city. We didn't see companies reducing the size of their office and letting their leases go up. What we're seeing with COVID in the New York area, at least, is people are moving to the they're getting out of the downtown core as far as a living and moving to the suburbs and out of the city urban areas. Plus, big companies have reduced the number of offices they have in the city. If they've had 4 and some of the leases were up, they've consolidated. They're still having an office, but not as much. So I do think there is a change we're going to see in some of the behavioral and some of the patterns. Whereas, as I was saying before, the other ones, you had a drop, but it came back on the same trend.
But for example, is it the same if we look at rural areas, for example? Now this is more for Gavin and Simon, which are, you study Oxfordshire County Council, and Simon is based in Exeter, which is quite rural. Especially, Gavin, you first. Have you noticed a difference or any different trend from the start of the pandemic against compared normal levels to when you started the project?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, within the project itself, we definitely saw that traffic was distributed throughout the day. So we were perhaps at 50% levels of normal, but we still had an AM peak, but we didn't have a PM peak. The PM peak just dropped a lot more dramatically. And we think that's because if people were still going to school or children were still going to school, they were still getting the lift in the morning. There was much more use of personal transit, as in cars, rather than public transport there. But then in the afternoon, people were being picked up at different times, and you didn't have the evening rush hour from people returning to work. So I think that's one thing we noticed during the time. But I think there's a general observation, which is that, and I know that some authorities have also said this as well, that traffic is just busy all the time now. So the AM and the PM may not be reaching to the same levels, but it's busy the whole time. And I think that's because you have a lot more flexibility. So whereas at the weekend, you may have done the shopping run to the retail park, you may have gone to the recycling centre, you may have done, seen the family. You pop out during the day because you have that flexibility. Maybe you drive somewhere to go for a nice run or cycle with a friend or a work colleague. I think there's a whole manner of different things going on. It kind of relates a little bit to what David was saying, which is actually, there's so many different scenarios now. People are using the time so differently than they were. I've been into London, which is where our office. I'm in London today. I've been in every week throughout the whole situation, or every 2 weeks during the real peak period. We're now back to 2 or 3 days a week in the office. It's a co-share building. It's definitely a lot less busier than normal. But actually, if you go out to the streets, people are starting to bounce back over the last 2 weeks. There is, the market stalls with food are now serving food. There is queues. There is busyness. There is a vibe. I actually think the vibe will come back. I think people will miss working from the office, and the fact that it provides a really productive, innovative working place to collaborate and go forward. I think once authorities start to come back to the offices, I think that will then kick off meetings, and I think it will just be a self-fulfilling prophecy that when you can start to meet people, traffic will bounce back even further. So I think it will come back quicker and sharper than we realise.
Samuel, have you noticed the same in Exeter? Exeter is in the southeast of England, which is much more rural compared to the Oxfordshire and the hinterland of London.
So I've actually only ever been to Exeter twice. I joined City Science a week before lockdown. So I'm based in London, and I'm based in a very central bit of London, which is really nice. Doesn't have many cars in it, but I think the key thing, and to kind of echo what Gavin's saying there, is we need to be thinking about the wider trip. And too often we've also looked at that because that's what we do. We commute, and therefore we see that. And so we need to make sure that like freight deliveries or light goods vehicles have increased quite a bit, but so has cycle deliveries. And then also that school patch, which has always been that peak. You can always see the peak drop during school periods, and that's your other normal, so to speak. We're still seeing that, and people are going to be even more complacent and more determined to drop their kids at school because they'll be worried about like everything else going on. Being in public transport. Imagine us kids being in public transport, which coming from a public transport guy, that's really bad for me to be saying. But there's that whole element around it. So what concerns me is when we get that peak back, how many more people are going to be in their cars than used to be? And so we need to make sure that we're putting in policies now that are going to stop that.
A question for David now. We have seen your work around the post-pandemic and what are the attitudes towards the future in a survey. But do you think that forecasts on travel demand are now completely useless? What are the transport authorities needs to do in order to understand what are the future scenarios following the evidence that you collected?
Yeah, I think if you're using an old forecast, then they are quite close to useless, certainly in the short to medium term. But I think maybe if you go forward 5 and 10 years, you might look back and not be able to spot COVID. But certainly over the next 5 years, old forecasts, pre-COVID based forecasts are useless, I would say, for the reasons that the other guys have shown, that basically that traffic change, it is coming back, but it won't come back in necessarily the same way. There will be a gradual change in land use as people who can work from home don't have to be within a commute or an easy commute of their office. So there'll be a shift to potentially longer commuting on the trips they do make. So yes, in a word, I think the short-term forecast that based on a pre-COVID travel pattern should not be being used for any decision making. I think if you go 5 and 10 years, you could argue that it's normal service will be resumed, and maybe not even argue that, particularly when you start looking at the carbon impacts and the things we're going to have to do, which is my other area of interest is decarbonising transport. So I think that starts to become a bigger change on travel behaviour, just because it has to, effectively, tying into electric vehicles and so forth. So anyway, I think the changes and the big ones, I think there will still be a downturn in city centre employment. There will be a downturn in city centre vitality, so reasons for going to a city centre and whatever else in London might buck that trend. But I think in general there will be a less need to go into city centres, which isn't just commuting, but it comes from that commuting change of pattern, change ultimately over of that office space into retail, etc., into residential. Will happen just because there isn't the need for the previous city centre office space. So yes, the world has changed, and I don't think it will bounce back. And our surveys suggest that is the case. And the trick is to make sure that there is a public transport network still available whenever people do come back to using it, because that's the big risk, is the economic vitality of the bus networks in particular, or the public transport networks.
So, next question. What do you think is the best way to use the new data that are arising from the sensors and the Internet of Things in general? Mostly are collected and installed all over our cities now. This data becomes available for our modeling. For example, Gavin mentioned Vivacity and Sense. Vivacity are deployed is an SME based in the UK and deploys an extensive amount of sensors around traffic junction. One each. We start with Simon because he is more focusing on data-driven modeling. How do you think that we should use data and modeling tools? How they should evolve in order to help in the decision maker to understand the current trends and what might be the future scenarios?
So I think actually Gavin's tool showed this rather well, where we we need to be almost having our models updating a lot more regularly, like the 5-year timescale, which is the UK limit, because the data is just there. And how do we make sure our models are tied to that data in a way that our options between 1 year and another can still be evaluated against each other? And I think it's a challenge that we still need to work through. But the more we can connect our models and our model development to be more automated and more connected to live data, so that then we might have had a COVID-ready model if someone was actually asking what's going to happen with traffic running. But I'm sure that the others would have further thoughts on that.
A question for Gavin, because you collected a lot of data and more was mostly data-driven, as well as Simon said.
Yeah.
Is there a way to consider the transferability of your fundings around your typical day? Because you said there are no typical days. Each day is different. Effectively, you can have several profiles and then attempt to do a forecast of the travel demand from what you measure at the moment. Have you thought to include also artificial intelligence to transfer the methodology to other areas in the UK, but also in the world?
That's about that. I think we could start the session again on just those questions that you just asked. I'll take the simple ones and the near field ones first, if I may. I think one, models have got lots of different purposes, whether it's a 30-year investment plan for infrastructure business case, or whether it's for operational use, a bus priority. So, two ends of the scale that models could be used for. I think we have to be a bit pragmatic. So through the work we did, because we're effectively we're collating that data through the use of the live system. We can take that data over a period of time, so be it 6, 12 months, 2 years, and then we can use that to effectively update our traffic flow, our origin destination matrix. It's not the strict science of demand modeling, and I'm not saying that it is, but actually pragmatically, it's a byproduct of the system. It's a reuse of data that exists, and it's much closer to real, near time or recent trends about what's happening. So I think that's one way that we can use the data within the byproducts of the system. So not only are we using it then for an operational system, but we can use it for transport planning to understand different scenarios. A good example there is that we will collect data on the day of a match day. So let's just put COVID to one side. So there is a big match. We'll collect the data on that match day. We'll understand the traffic flows across the network on that particular time. And from that, we could effectively create a demand set that we could then use for other event planning of that sort of nature. But you're never, as a transport planner, you're not going to have the budget to go out and go and collect that data before it happens or whilst it happens in an offline environment. That doesn't exist. So I think these real-time systems actually start to get us into a much more digital world. It is a digitization process. So once you see what's possible, you can start to examine how you can then use it and how you move forward. And again, I want to use that word one more time. It's got to be pragmatic. So that maybe mean that you don't actually calibrate and validate your data set to the same level as possible, but actually maybe 85% is just good enough to be able to use it. And therefore, it's a balancing act. I hope that's answered some of the questions you asked.
Which reminds me to what Matt said in his presentation. We need the validation of the data and cross-referencing various types of data sets. For example, Matt, I think you mentioned here, and Tom, all of them, they got different penetration in various markets, especially a big variability around the world, depending on your country. But you never mentioned mobile network data or any satellite data, for example.
So here, Streetlight and TomTom, a lot of them are collecting multiple sources. One of the sources is mobile data. They have partnerships with various of the suppliers of the cell phones. And even now the cell phone vendors are getting into the data world of things and having that data available. And it's really tying that data with the planning data and bringing operations and plan, like Gavin said there, bringing operations and planning together so that the operational, what we learn in doing these operational short-term forecast models actually feeds the planning world and helps build that robust things. Because if as modelers, we come out, going back to an earlier question, and say the models are useless, you've got to just throw them out and start from scratch, that's going to cause a big problem in the industry, and I think it'll be a problem for the modeling world in general. But I think, like Simon was saying, we need to be more dynamic and not look at a 5-year, doing it once every 5 years, but work on our using AI and having automated processes to help a rolling update to these models, so that it's continuously learning. And that's where all this operational data, be it from third party or from systems, may actually help us.
Yeah, I mean, Matt, I just add, that's the synthesizing of the data together, the fusion of the different data sources, the real valuable. So I don't think there's one size fits all in all of this. And and David, you mentioned low emission zones. That's a really great source, especially in the UK, where there's several either going ahead or just about to go ahead. That's a really great richness of source of data to be able to provide us even more into these type of models, to be able to update continually. And so that's using using new assets by the side of the road to support the legacy assets of traffic control and ATCs. So again, it's just pulling it all together and then reusing it for the point of purpose.
And certainly I agree, the data should identify when it has spotted a change and alert the modeler and everybody else to say that there's something different now, whether that's COVID or the introduction of a new tram system or whatever it is, but there's something that the pattern is not any of the patterns, or it's 5% lower than the pattern that I was expecting or whatever. So that the data should be warning us that using the AI, and when the model, because if you need an average day for an appraisal point of view, has the average day changed, or is the model's average day not even the same as the average, even if it wasn't typical? You could still use average, but the data should be telling us when our model is not correct, basically, and then we then have access to that data to fix the problem, as it were.
Yeah.
The same applies to
the not average.
The same applies to things like census data, where in the UK, again, like we're using 2011, sorry, and it's so far out of date, and yet what we could have done is had sensor data to actually uplift that in certain places and work out where there was more activity going on. And so a tool that was actually doing that would be quite helpful for everyone to use consistently. Also, just on so we're doing some work with the University of Exeter at the moment, and they're actually developing something for us to automatically calibrate and validate models. But it's still got some work to do, but at least it's a step in the right direction. It's not necessarily going to do your real-time model validation like what the tool that my colleagues here were talking about, but at least actually get to that point where the time-consuming elements around that 5-year model update can be narrowed down, and then the cost can come down as well. And that way we can potentially even have models that are just available for more places by automating this and automating the development a lot more.
You mentioned in your presentation that many modeling tools are not available publicly because they're owned by the private sector. How do we promote healthy scrutiny and challenge, especially now that we got more data available, to condense that part of calibration and validation that we need to carry out? It's a question for you, Simon.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot in that. I think that if we just have calibration and validation in a static report at the end, I don't think that's enough. So we need to work out a way to make that more visual and make it a lot clearer. That would be my first thing. The ownership point is a whole nother issue. If it's privately owned by a private developer, that is a privately owned model. If it's publicly owned by a public authority, there are some sensitivities around that and some security elements around that, but we need to be thinking, like, what is the excuse for it not being open to everyone? Like, why is that? And that, I think, like I said, I wouldn't expect a model to be available for everyone to use openly fully. I expect the outputs and the tool to at least provide somewhat of functionality that can be used openly. And that's just my challenge. If it's public money, why is it? Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered the question.
That's fine. I don't think there is a correct answer. Like Peter said, most of the models are owned by the public sector because the local authorities, for example, they don't have enough people able to run and use the model themselves. So it's also part of the picture. What Another question, what new appraisal methodologies needs to be applied in the future? We've discussed issues of equity, equality, and livability of places, but what other measures should be included into new appraisal methodologies? David?
Yeah, if I could, I would say the ability to correctly cost decarbonisation or give the benefits for decarbonisation, because at the minute the price of carbon is not correct. If we are trying to get to a decarbonisation pathway, net zero, at the minute the appraisal is not recommending what the amount of change that's needed to get onto that pathway before technology does or doesn't solve the problem. So I think we're completely underestimating the work that's needed. And if you're using standard appraisal, you will not get a decarbonisation pathway. And if you do a decarbonisation pathway, you'll end up something like a negative NPV, and everybody will ask you what you're doing, because that isn't the right scheme under the current appraisal. And clearly, you have to do both, basically, come up with the most cost-effective solutions that get you to a decarbonised world, basically. So I think that's the biggest change. Second to that is the quality of place, health benefits, all the proper benefits or the real benefit of making a city centre or a town centre a nicer place to be walking, cycling, or sitting having a coffee. And I think they are all they're coming, but they're not really yet certainly in the UK's appraisal toolbox properly. So I would say those are the two big gaps.
And just to add to that, I think one of the things that's always a challenge is how you equate the value of time across the spectrum of drivers. And lots of times that gets shortcut, and we definitely don't change the value of time from somebody biking versus walking versus taking the car. And that may be somewhere where we have to, in the equality and equity side of things, really look at how we implement that. It was always the impression in the United States that the people with the most money are the ones who use the toll lanes. But the reality is, it's actually sometimes the person who has to get home by 6 to pick up their kid, or they get an extra fee, that is more driven to be in those fast lanes.
So I've got here another question. I will rephrase that because we both you, Matt, and David, you talk about predicting the new travel demand, forecasting the demand in the future, and both of the scenarios that you picked up, they're quite different. For example, you say that people is more willing to use private car, and so the single occupancy vehicle will rise, and we will have less commuting trips. But how can you make sure that, because of the uncertainty that is linked to this area, that we are not observing through the data just a suppressed demand rather than a new travel behavior? First Matt and then David.
Sorry, just a minute. I think that the challenge is that there's so many unknowns with that. We may it's not about suppressing the demand. The demand will come back. It's just going to be different. So really, we just have to make sure we're tied to these live and not real time, but like these continually updating data sources, so that we can be on top of things. We're gonna be in a little bit of a reactive mode for a little while as things start to unfold. But I would say it's not that demand has been suppressed, it's just that it's changed. And when it comes back, the way, we may have more cars, not because there's more demand, but just because the comfort level of people in their own vehicles and how they're getting to trips. I think they'll still be going to work, but it just won't be the same. I don't know if I answered the question.
There are no correct answers at the moment, so you're saying.
And I would say that the sort of fear of PT will go away fairly quickly whenever the sort of everybody forgets COVID or whatever. So it's the thing that is changing is the working from home and the online meetings and stuff. So the demand has changed. When I decide to go into the office in 2 years' time, if I have a bus and a car that I have to pay a large parking charge for, or a walk through the rain or whatever, I think my mode split will go back to pretty much what it was. But I won't be making that trip as often. And there might not be as many buses in that year, because the bus company might not survive or the level of service might not be maintained because it is having to suffer really badly at the minute from driving empty buses, basically. So I think it's what will happen to the bus network or the public transport network and the travel behaviour, which will then have a sort of a vicious circle, because the public transport is geared up to getting commuters into work, who then, because they're making a regular trip, if they're not going into work, the bus companies are losing money even before they start cutting services. So I think it's that lack of, or the impact on the bus network is more important than the anti-PT thing, which is very much a current, very, very short-term fear of public transport. That will go away, but hopefully before the buses go away as well.
Online shopping is something that also increased quite a lot. You mentioned that you might have a decrease in emissions linked to online shopping, but I'm slightly be more provocative. What if instead these trends and the emissions are totally linked to the private sectors and the supply chains and the last mile deliveries that we're using? What if we drive an increase in last mile deliveries because of the new shopping habits? So we remove the leisure trips from one side, but we increase the demand and the travel of last mile deliveries from bike vans, for example.
Yeah, I think the big risk is people ordering a duster on Amazon, because they need a duster, and then at 20 minutes later they order something else, some garden furniture or whatever. So I think that just in time next day delivery Amazon Prime level is not efficient, no matter how good Amazon are at making their logistics efficient. If you're generating lots of goods vehicles to deliver single items, that is going to generate more goods travel than it would have cost if you'd waited to go into the city or into the town centre and buy all those things, once a fortnight or whatever. So I think that we really, from a carbon point of view, we've really got to stop that. And obviously, as soon as those vans go electric, it helps, but it's still creating traffic congestion. So I would say that's the biggest impact of retail is the just-in-time buying, small amounts rather than the big weekly shop, which is probably more efficient to let Sainsbury's decide when to deliver it. But ordering dusters from Amazon or your next book or whatever, books are old hat, but whatever, that buying one item at a time and getting it delivered by a man in a van is not a sustainable way of going forward, in my humble opinion.
It may be that we have to do uncomfortable decision, especially from the transport authorities' point of view. Simon, do you think that you require the general public will have to do different choices in the future, or which service to prioritize in order to have and decarbonize the transport system? Do you think that the tools that you're developing, which are data-driven, can show the evidence to the general public and the impact that their decision can make on the transport network?
So I think the first thing is, oh sorry, was that Gavin or me?
No, for Simon.
I think the first thing is fixing the fact that carbon shouldn't have a discount rate that goes negative. It should have the reverse of that, where the impact of carbon is going to get bigger the longer we leave it. And I think flipping that is the first step towards that. The other thing is that we can't necessarily use the tools that the preferences people have at the moment, and the travel patterns they have at the moment, and even the preferences which they're saying to forecast in the way we are, and which is a very complicated position to be in, where we've never had a certain future. But from a modeling point of view, but when we start to talk about like Amazon deliveries and stuff, it's like, how does that feed into our modeling is the key question there. And I doubt we're ever going to get data from Amazon to help inform how like the peaks and troughs of their trips. So we're just going to have to monitor that on the day. And like this is where I think the uncertainty is massive here around what are we even modeling anymore. Like people's preferences. You might say you're going to be scared of public transport, and actually you're not, because you will just go and take it when you need to. In the same way that people probably say they don't use toll lanes until they suddenly do. So I think how we gain difference from, whether it's from AI, like observing the data and trying to work out trends from that, maybe that's, but I think asking people their preferences of how they will travel post-COVID, I don't think will get us there. So I'm not really sure where the data is going to come from that's really going to inform this, but I think our tools need to at least align it as much with actually we need to be thinking less about the pandemic and more about the carbon crisis now from a transport point of view. Because if the pandemic comes back, people will travel less. That's a good thing for transport. Probably not a good thing for transport planners, but good thing for transport. The key thing is though, that how do we make sure that we can continue the positives from that? Sorry.
So
Patricia,
I think,
just one comment I wanted to say. It probably goes back about 3 sort of items, but I just wanted to say let's not forget humans. You know, humans are great at observation. We have fantastic observation skills. So when we're talking about realistic models, there's nothing better than actually to go out and actually see what's happening on the streets and actually visualize it and understand what's actually happening today. So I urge the whole audience to go out and do the normal work trip just once, just to see actually how it's changed, because until you've done that, you don't know. So that's not being controversial, but that is just saying, you know, actually the best way to understand whether your model is a valid model is to talk to the traffic engineer, because the traffic engineer will know the exact point where it queues today, last year, or the year before. So let's just not forget the human element in this, please, because I really think that's important. Sorry, there wasn't a right place to say that, so I just thought I'm going to say it, perhaps even close to the end. But
well, people are returning to pubs, so presumably they'll return to public transport as well,
well,
right?
no, do you know what? It's a really good example. We're talking to a guy that's come into the office today. Nobody on the tube this morning, or very few people on the tube this morning, but going to Covent Garden on Saturday, packed.
Yeah.
You know, so it's okay to go to the pub, but it's not okay to go to work. You know.
Well, you can work from home, but it's much more fun to go have a drink or dinner out, I guess.
I know, but I think it's a good example of, you know, the change in traffic patterns and what's acceptable and not acceptable. You know, I'm not disregarding. It's just a good example that actually normally the tube to Covent Garden from his location to there. Covent Garden's in London, by the way, if anybody doesn't know. You know, it probably wouldn't be as bad, but it's, you know, it's just that disparity between the normal norm and today's current
and the new norm.
And it'll be different in 2 weeks' time. That's the great thing. It'll be different in 2 weeks' time. It'll be different in a month, I swear.
So we can still model that probably, especially with Aimsun. So a shorter term prediction will be much easier to achieve rather than a strategic model, which is 10, 20, 30 years time. And we don't know yet if the COVID pandemic will be a glitch in the system or if we totally compromise our strategic transport modeling, basically. And on this note, I think I already exhausted all the questions, and I also did more to you. I hope you enjoyed the session. Time is up. Thank you for joining that. And thank you to the audience for the questions as well.
Thanks, Patricia. Good job.
Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.